Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to the 5th IFSO Journal Club. And it's my pleasure and privilege to host Dr. Daniel Riccioppo. He has a PhD in digestive surgery in the University of São Paulo School of Medicine. He's a member of IFSO, ASMBS, SAGES, and the Brazilian Societies of General Digestive and Bariatric Surgery. He's also an assistant professor in the unit of bariatric and metabolic surgery in São Paulo, Brazil. So, Dr. Riccioppo, it's an honor and a privilege, and we're going to talk about your interesting article, which is small volume, fast emptying gastric pouch leads to better long-term weight loss and food tolerance after Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. So please, I'll let you speak about the study, and then we'll go through it in details.
Thank you, Dr. Bashir, and thank you, IFSO, for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate to this webinar and this discussion about our paper. And we started to thinking about studying this field. In our institution, we have a weekly meeting when we discuss these special cases and mostly regain weight patients. And we always thinking about what happened with this patient, if enlargement of the pouch have some participation in some way in this weight regain, and what's the causes. And that's the motivation to my PhD study that addressed these issues. And this paper is this study is resulted in this paper that it's my pleasure to discuss these results with you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Riccioppo. So let's start. How did you actually think about the idea studying the size of the pouch with emptying in your practice in Roux-en-Y gastric bypass?
It's a very interesting issue, because in these meetings with our staff that I talked about with you before, we have some cases of weight regain with patients with vomiting and protein intolerance. It's quite paradoxical, because they don't eat meat or protein, and they vomit almost every day, and they also have weight regain. And so we started to think about study functionally, the functionality of this surgery, the gastric bypass surgery, and what happens with this patient that had vomiting and also weight regain. So this is the main motivation to study the aspects of functionality and the morpho-anatomical aspects of the surgery with these tools, the volumetry with the tomography, the three-dimensional tomography, and scintigraphic study with solid foods that give us some answers about what happens with these patients with these issues, mostly with weight regain. Yeah.
Okay, great. So you managed to collect 80 patients and excluded 13, 4 of them actually had the issues, complications. That's why you excluded them. And you ended up with 67 patients of Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. What was your technique? How did you do your Roux-en-Y gastric bypass?
Yes, this in our institution we do today maybe 70% of the surgeries bypass and 30% is sleeve gastrectomy, and 70% of all surgeries are today laparoscopically. And back in those days that we collect those data, the 30% of the surgeries was laparoscopic and 70% was in open. So mostly of these patients was in, the surgery was performed by open way. And so we collected, when we collected the data, we excluded the laparoscopic patients, and we work only with open patients to avoid this bias. And specifically about the bypass, we do it with the same technique, laparoscopically or conventional access, with doing we try mainly to perform the smaller pouch possible. Maybe do the first stapling 4 to 5 centimeters of the gastroesophageal junction, and we try always to avoid the gastric fundum in the pouch. We mainly the posterior in the posterior wall of the gastric pouch. We have some specifically care in dissecting the fundus, the posterior fundus, to maintain it in the gastric remnant and not in the pouch. And we made the gastrojejunal anastomosis manually when it's doing open, and mechanically with a linear stapling we do it laparoscopically. And today we do it mostly in pre-gastric, pre-colic way, but in the past we did most of the surgeries in heterocolic or heterogastric way. And we don't use any kind of calibration in the gastric jejunal anastomosis. We do it in maybe 2 to 3 centimeters long, and avoid any type of restriction. Since 2006, we don't use any more silastic ring, and we have quite issues with restriction in these patients with ring in the prior experience. So today we don't use anymore any kind of restriction in these patients. And the alimentary and biliopancreatic limbs, we do it always with 100 centimeters extension. And I think that's it. Technically, the main steps of the surgery is this description.
Great. So all of the study patients were done open, retrocolic, retrogastric, hands-on gastrojejunectomy without use of any calibration.
Yes. Actually, we performed endoscopy in all these patients when we studied this group in the late postoperative time, and we excluded the patients that have some kind of restriction, like anastomosis stenosis or something like this, to avoid this bias, this influence in gastric emptying. So we only included patients with large anastomosis without any kind of difficulty to pass the endoscopy during the examination.
Okay, great. And the studies that you performed, the 3D volumetry and the gastric emptying scintigraphy, those were done when, at which point during the patient follow-up?
Yes, only in the late follow-up we performed this investigation. We don't since it's a cohort study, and we have a main concern about what happened with these patients in late follow-up. We have a mean follow-up of 48 months, 4 years, and this is a retrospective study. So we only performed this investigation in this late follow-up, and we don't have this kind of comparative study with these patients. Have a study of this volumetry right after the surgery, only in the late part of postoperative time.
And I see from the study that majority of the patients are actually have a BMI of more than 50. 90% are females, and actually a lot of them are the mean age was 51. So you have an old population that has a BMI greater than 50, and females. Do you think this affected your results at any point?
Yeah, that's interesting questions. Yes, mostly of our patients were female, and 91% actually, but in almost all the studies in bariatric surgery field, the mainly of these populations are women. So maybe 70 to 80% of all these studies addressing only women. And why, I don't know, but in Westworld, it's a fact. We operate mainly women. So our studies are almost always about female patients. Yeah. And about the age, I don't think 50 years is old. I'm 45, so I think it's young patients. So, but yes, it could be a bias, but it's not intentional. We try to collect these patients in a random way in our postoperative ambulatory where we follow these patients. So it's like a interesting thing, but it's quite a non-intentional thing that we have mostly patients with 40 or 50th decade of life. And about the BMI, our mean BMI in our service is 48. So we operate quite big patients actually. But we think about this issue, if it could be a bias, and we stratified our group in super obese and non-super obese patients. We did not have a difference in results when we stratified in super obese and non-super obese patients. And we initially we think that we would have a difference because in patients with BMI more than 50, we always think that it would be we will have some technical issues in performing a smaller pouch. But when we look up to these data and stratify the patients by BMI, we don't saw this difference. So this was not a bias in our group. It's interesting. And okay.
And so you looked at BMI specifically, and you did not find any difference between the patients who had less or greater. Did you look at age, mainly, let's say, be above 50, below 50? Because some papers, they talk about a difference in response and a difference in weight loss that is due to age. Did you look at that in your study design?
Yes, we stratified by age, but since in this specific issue, we did not have any substantial patients with with a younger age, so we did not find any difference. But this is statistically we can't use this information because there's no significant patients within lower ages. So this could be, yes, this could be a bias. Yes, for sure. Yeah, we think in younger patients, of course, we expect a better performant weight loss. But we have another study in our group addressing elderly patients, and we saw this difference mainly in patients with more than 60 years. So
60 years. Okay.
yeah. So
Okay.
but it could be a bias. Yes, this could
Okay.
be.
Okay. And you know, the gist of your study, which is the amazing part of the study, is a small pouch with great drainage and great emptying produce better weight loss. And you specifically separate the patients into three groups with emptying less than 12% and at 1 hour, retention of less than 2% at 1 hour versus retention greater than 25% at 1 hour. And there's a statistically significant difference in weight loss, food tolerance, and long-term weight loss, right? Long-term weight maintenance, but not excess weight loss, nadir excess weight loss, right?
Yes. All these patients have had a good weight loss in nadir in the lower part of the curve, the weight loss curve. But there's a difference between weight regain in these two groups: the patients with more faster emptying and the patients with a slower gastric emptying in 1 hour. But because in more than 1 hour, all these patients have a faster emptying speed if you compare with patients without surgery. So we think that this difference in weight loss have some substantial correlation with this very fast gastric emptying in this group that retains less than 12% of the solid sample of food in the first hour in the scintigraphy. We think this could be because of some correlation between the gastric emptying speed and the interhormonal response. But we did not study specifically this field, but we have some works, some papers that corroborate this line of thought, like the work performed by the group of Dirksen in that studied gastric emptying, gastric bypass, and sleeve gastrectomy, and the GLP-1 and PYY responses after meal. So this could be the reason, the explanation of our results.
And have you noticed increased dumping between the two groups? I know you comment on this in the paper, but are dumping symptoms more exaggerated in the faster draining patients as opposed to ones with high tension at 1 hour?
Yeah, since we studied these patients mostly in a late postoperative time, with a mean of 4 years after surgery, we did not saw significant or important dumping symptoms in these patients. We think that happens because they learn how to avoid the symptoms with some changes in food consumption patterns, or avoiding some foods that give those patients these symptoms. After 6 months to 1 year after surgery, in our experience, we saw this quite a drop in the symptoms of dumping in these patients, mainly because they learn how to avoid the symptoms that are quite important in this early postoperative days. Yeah. But no, we did not saw a significant incidence of dumping in these patients, no.
And no difference between the two groups?
No, we did not study these symptoms specifically. We only use a food intolerance questionnaire and not some questionnaire addressing symptoms of specifically symptoms of dumping. But in the interviews of these patients, I asked about the symptoms, because most of these patients are patients that I already follow for years in our service. So in this group specifically, dumping was not important, a significant problem. But we did not study in our paper these symptoms specifically.
And how do you correlate the faster drainage with a better food tolerance in your study? You comment that in the paper, and the patients who had better drainage had better food tolerance.
Oh yeah. This is in all our finds in this study, I think this correlation was the easier one, because we have a lot of experience in our country with silastic ring gastric bypass. Professor Garrido, that was a former IFSO president, was the father of bariatric surgery in Brazil, and he made he had a large experience with FOBI pouch operation and Capella operation, and he was also a former professor in our service. So we had a lot of experience with a silastic ring gastric bypass, and we saw it's quite common to saw these patients that we still have these days, because we stopped to use a silastic ring in 2006. We still have a lot of patients with this restriction in our institution, and we have a lot of problems with food intolerance. So I think that a better gastric emptying, it's quite a mandatory that it's a thing that you have to do to avoid these problems with food intolerance in gastric bypass surgery. And today we perform a large gastric jejunal anastomosis to avoid specifically this situation, this problem. So this correlation was quite not a difficult thing to think about it. If the pouch empties faster, these patients could eat more foods that normally are more difficult to eat in surgeries that we have more restriction. So we think it's quite easy to understand.
The one thing that you specifically note is a better food tolerance, better eating pattern may result in a better, longer term weight maintenance and better intrahormonal response in Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, which is exactly the opposite of papers stating banded gastric bypass produce better long-term weight maintenance and better excess weight loss than non-banded gastric bypass. This is the gist of your paper, and this is the unique part of your paper. I congratulate you very much on your work. And you know, to end, are there any points that you wanted to do better in your study?
Yes. There's a lot of things that we could do that we could did in a better way in our study. There's a lot of things that we could do to enhance the power of our results. The first one is to do it in a prospectively way, of course. But with this size of the group that we studied, and with the mean postoperative time that we studied, it's quite difficult to do these morphofunctional studies in the early postoperative time and then wait 3 to 4 years and do it again. So it's quite difficult in 60 to 70 patients, but it would be great if we could do it. And another thing that we want to study, because we did not study in our paper, in our work, but we have also another study in our group that addressed this correlation between weight regain and intrahormonal responses after meal. It's a paper of our friend Dr. Santo that was published also in Obesity Surgery that correlates attenuation in intrahormonal responses and worse performing in maintenance of weight loss in a long term of gastric bypass. So we try to link these two studies and correlates this better gastric emptying with better performance in interhormonal responses that we believe that this could be an answer of why these patients with a smaller pouch and faster emptying pouches have this better results in the long term, because today the interhormonal responses is the main reason why this surgery, the bariatric surgery, works. We don't believe anymore in restriction as a main cause of results of these surgeries anymore. At least we in our group, we don't believe in this, but we need data to corroborate this line of thought. So it's a thing that we want to do in the future.
That is great. Congratulations on your work, and hopefully we'll look for the collaborative study hopefully soon. And looking forward to the Facebook discussion on the 21st of June. Please join us on that date for a great, interesting discussion on this amazing paper by Dr. Riccioppo. Thank you, Dr. Riccioppo, again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Until 21 of June. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yes, yes. Thank you.